Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I want to talk about our 27th president, William Howard Taft. However, I want to focus on his tenure as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Of course, William Howard Taft is our only president who served as the head of the executive, as president of the United States, and as head of the U.S. judiciary as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, of course, his tenure as Chief Justice came, many years after he'd already left the presidency. He lost the presidency after, in a three-way contest in which he came third. And this is due to uh, the fallout between him and his best friend, his former best friend, who literally handpicked him to become, his successor. That's Teddy Roosevelt, who went on to form the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And of course, they subsequently lost to the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, who went on to become the 28th president. Woodrow Wilson, of course, being the president, our most educated president. He had a PhD, he had a law degree. He also served as president of Princeton University. I'm just going to give a little bit backstory to William Howard Taft's, just give his biography just a little bit. I want to focus on uh, a specific case called Gong Lum versus Rice, which deals with education. William Howard Taft would go on in that decision to uphold segregation in public schools. That decision has gone on to be called the worst decision or the most racist decision in the 20th century, of course, and it was subsequently overturned by the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. And that, of course, laid the foundation to subsequent desegregation up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, William Howard Taft was born to something of an upper middle class family, not a wealthy family, but they had public service in their lineage. His father had been Secretary of War and U.S. Attorney General under Ulysses Grant. He'd also been a judge and an ambassador, and all these. It appears William Howard Taft would end up replicating. William Howard Taft went to Yale for undergrad, and he graduated second in his class, which is quite bizarre since his best friend, when they were disputing for the presidency, when Taft was, trying to get a second term, and uh, Roosevelt himself was trying to return to the White House after a hiatus. Um, Roosevelt infamously called him unintelligent by calling him a puzzlewit, having brains of a guinea pig and a fat head. And, so with those comments, from the tempestuous uh, Teddy Roosevelt, who of course was intelligent himself, but he didn't graduate from law school. He left law school out of boredom. I think uh, historians and psychohistorians, whatever you want to call them, uh, they claim in retrospect that Teddy Roosevelt must have been bipolar. That he probably had he suffered from manic depression. It wasn't an illness that was diagnosable at that time because but some of our presidents have been diagnosed posthumously as manic depressive, including one of my favorite presidents, John Adams. Um, you know, Teddy Roosevelt was a bombastic person. I read his autobiography, which was very well written. But the things he says, it's clear that he did have some kind of weird, grandiose ideation, whatever. Yeah, he he was rather grandiose and bombastic. So him calling William Howard Taft his former best friend on intelligence, the words he used were uh, the apparent words he used were uh, puzzle wits, having the brains of a guinea pig, and a fathead. You know. By the way, Howard Taft, of course, is still on record as our heaviest president, the most obese president we've ever had, and so. In fact, I think there's a lot of rumor regarding his weight. You know, it's whether it's apocryphal to say he was really stuck in the White House bathtub, but I think they did reconstruct a a bathroom for to meet his to suit his needs, right? Right, but I don't know. In any event, so he graduated second in his class, and interestingly, I took an interest in studying uh, the um, the work of psychologists who compute the IQs of American presidents through histometrics, right? IQ tests weren't invented, uh, back in back in the day. Of course, from the time of our president, they're more recent phenomena, but they're historians and psychologists who can use um, the accomplishments and the biography of former presidents, and sort of guesstimate, compute some kind of IQ, of the president, of the former presidents. And interestingly, Teddy Roosevelt is often given one of the highest IQs of American presidents. He scores, compares to John Adams. Yeah, I think there's a book that I read. It's about the IQs of American presidents. It's an article, journal article, sort of, and Teddy Roosevelt is normally scored at about 153. John Adams 155, right? And Howard Taft compares has one of the lowest IQs, surprisingly, even though he's the only president who went on to be Chief Justice. Um, he graduated second in his class from Yale, but he's normally scored one of the lowest IQs. In fact, he compares with George W., whom people assume should have, one of the lowest IQs. He does have one of the lowest, but not quite the lowest in this um, study I read. Um, was given an estimated IQ of about 139. George Bush 138. And these are still rather high, right? But compared to the other presidents, it's rather low. While Teddy Roosevelt is given an estimated IQ of about 153. Um, in any event, Howard Taft went on to attend Cincinnati Law School, where and qualified as a lawyer. He became a judge very early in life. He served as a federal judge, and he he was very successful as a public servant, and he he developed a close relationship with the tempestuous, dynamic Teddy Roosevelt. Um, he also served under President McKinley. He served as the was a governor general of the Philippines. He also subsequently served as provisional governor of Cuba. So he got into a number of administrative jobs. He'd also served as a federal judge prior to that, and then when his buddy Teddy Roosevelt became president following the assassination of William McKinley, he became Secretary of War. And when Teddy was leaving, Teddy Roosevelt convinced him, talked him, strong armed him, bullied him into becoming into running for president. And of course, he did win and became president. Now he had an uneventful, unremarkable tenure as president. Uh, Teddy Roosevelt, though he was a Republican, he was a progressive Republican. So it was during the Gilded Age, and of course the time of the huge corporations, and of course with the fallout of the effects of America's industrialization, the dangerous working conditions of the working class Americans. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, became a man of the people who was supporting the working class, and he came up against the large corporations, the corruption, and so he's known as a trust buster. However, when Taft became president, he sort of became a conservative, left the progressive cause, and sort of was siding with the corporations, the big corporations, and you see it in his court decisions. So, I wanted to talk about his time as a chief justice. After he left office, interestingly, because he'd been a former president and he'd appointed many federal judges, he had an issue with going back into private practice as a lawyer because there'd be a lot of conflict of interest, right? Potential conflicts of interest since he'd appointed so many federal judges, and so it would be difficult for him to 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 have a case in which a federal judge he'd not appointed, was not uh, the deciding judge. So he would have that quandary. So fortunately for him, though, he was appointed. He was offered a position as a professor of law and legal history at Yale University's alma mater, and so he went on to become a professor of law. So he had a very remarkable career as a public servant, as an attorney, as an intellectual. Um, and he got lucky under President when Warren G. Harding became president, and he appointed him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, one of the cases, I would like to actually look at several of his cases, but I want to keep this video short, so I'm just going to look at one. Uh, that's Gong Lum versus Rice. Uh, so this is also very important because of the times, right? I'm an American citizen originally from Nigeria, but I came to America with the interest of just getting my education. So I was once an international student, and of course I got my education, and I will, just explain, give my backstory, and how there's some kind of parallel. I find some kind of nexus relationship between my experience as an international student and then now as an American citizen, and this case, Gong Lum versus Rice. So it's a 1927 case. Now, Gong Lum was a Chinese man who owned a grocery store, right? It is said he came originally illegally into the United States, but this was during the time when there was like a great migration of Black Americans who wanted to leave sharecropping, which was just a new form of slavery, and go, and they moved up north, especially given the World War. It left when the white males went off to war, and then there were vacancies in the factories up north. And so black workers left the South and migrated up north to fill those vacancies. And so it also created an opportunity uh, for Chinese migrants to move down south to fill these jobs. Now, Gonglom opened some stores down south, and that's in Mississippi. He settled in Mississippi, and this is rather interesting because um, the 1920s, in 1924, President Calvin Coolidge, of course, passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which barred Asians from immigrating to America. barred all Asians from immigrating to America. And so he had a daughter by the name of Martha, and she had been going to a white school. So Gonglom was had a store a black in a black neighborhood in the Benoit community of was it Bolivar County. So it was his customers were black, were the black community because that was the era of segregation because the white stores wouldn't serve them, right? So he was serving the black community. That's uh, the Chinese immigrant Gong Lum. His name was Gong Lum. So he was serving the black community with his grocery store, and his daughter had been attending white schools because there was segregation. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 legalized segregation between black and whites in the South, and it said created separate but equal. So it created parallel systems in the U.S. in the South. So they had schools for black people, black kids. They had schools for white kids, and that was the law. So Gong Lung didn't want his daughter Martha had been attending white schools, but once there was the new law in 1924, federal law, which banned Asians from immigrating to the United States, the schools now said, well, that their daughter could no longer attend white schools, that they had to go to a colored school. Now, colored was sort of, it was understood to be synonymous with being black or non-white. It turns out, well, the court would clarify that it's an umbrella term for if you're not white. If you're not white, you are colored. So, and there were earlier cases regarding this, but this particular case, so Gong Lum wanted filed a lawsuit against the trustees of, the Mississippi district, the public schools. And of course, that's why it has the name of Rice. He filed a lawsuit, and there was a guy who represented him. He was actually a former governor of Mississippi. His name was Earl Brewer. Earl Brewer, after he was governor, started to take on civil rights cases. In fact, he represented, black people, and so he decided to represent, um, uh, the Lum family against Mississippi's, public schools because they didn't want their daughter to attend white schools. However, the argument he was making was pivoting on the 14th Amendment, ironically. Um, and bizarrely, right, even though he was saying that this violated, because 14th Amendment deals with discrimination, right? It prevents the state governments from discriminating on the basis of race or, suspect classifications, right? Other categories, race, national origin, gender, that's basically what it covers. Of course, it deals with citizenship as well. So Gonglun's daughter was born in the U.S. She was an American citizen. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship as well. It defines citizenship that if people are born here or naturalized, they're United States citizens, and also provides equal protection of the law, right? And due process and equal protection. That equal protection is saying you cannot discriminate, treat everyone equally, right? So, um, and with Plessy in 1896, of course, that was an uncanonical law because it was saying, well, that so long as you create a parallel system, right, there's equal protection, right? If you protect, separate is equal. So that was what Plessy versus Ferguson did. So Brewer's argument was that it was arguing two things. It was saying that, well, that it's funny. Well, the crux of his argument, though, and this he sort of won initially at the district level, he was arguing that uh, And that was what the Lum family were saying. They were not against the segregation. They were not against segregated schools. That was not what they were arguing against, because I've seen um, articles arguing that that was a precursor of the anti-segregation laws. They were not arguing against segregation, right? So what they were saying was that their daughter Martha Loom had been misclassified as colored, right? That colored was seemed to subsume or seemed to infer being black. And so they were arguing that they were being misclassified as colored and should be allowed to attend the white schools. I think the white schools were in Rosedale, right? They should be allowed to attend the white schools, right? So they weren't arguing, saying that, well, segregation is bad. They didn't want to attend the black schools. That's basically what the Lum family was arguing against, right? They didn't want to attend the black schools. Of course, the black schools were underfunded, and but that's where the black kids were going to. That's where they were getting their education. And in Mississippi at that time, they couldn't just homeschool their daughter. The law was that they had to go to school. So if they couldn't go to a public school, they could go to a private school. So at that time, maybe there were no private schools around or something. But the law was the kids had to go to school. So the Lum family didn't want their kid to go to black school. So they wanted, and they were saying that, well, their daughter they had been misclassified as being colored, assuming that colored inferred that they were black. They were saying they were not black. Well, the initially the district courts ruled in their favor, and they had a writ of mandamus, basically stopping, in telling the trustees that they had to admit, trustees of the white schools, that they had to admit, Martha Lum into the white schools. However, they filed suits, all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled in the trustees' favor, saying, well, that segregation is the law, it's constitutional, and the Lum family are not whites, and they made certain main arguments. Their main argument was that the purpose of the segregation in public schools was to keep the purity and integrity of the white race, right? And that, the Lum, the Chinese could not be classified as whites. They were not whites. That they were other races, that they were Mongolians. Basically they were saying that, well, that the purpose of segregation was to keep the purity of the white race from other races, including Mongolians. In fact, the laws in Mississippi, while it prevented um, other, Asians and black people from marrying white people, it allowed Asians and black people to intermarry, right? Their laws didn't care about if Asians and black people married each other, right? But the thing is, America is a place where immigrants come and they aspire to social status. So everybody shouts egalitarianism, but truly, it's a nation where immigrants were not, the high status or kings in their countries, wherever they came from, right? Their countries of origin. And so they assume that in America, their desire, their aspiration is to achieve that high status, king-like status, even though that's not spoken, it's not said out loud, right? And nobody admits, we have billionaires who are wealthier than kings, right? But we don't call him a king. We just give him a different nomenclature. Of course, that's a remarkable, that's the amazing quality of the English language with so many synonyms. So, hey, I don't know when we're going to decide to call billionaires what they really are. They're kings and dukes and aristocrats, right? The very thing that our constitution bans. But in any event, My point, I was saying that the Lum family, of course, they were aspirational, and they didn't want to be lumped at the bottom. They didn't want to be classified as colored. That was their argument, that they were misclassified as colored, uh, and that that they thought they should go to school with the white kids. But the Mississippi Supreme Court said no, that the purpose of the segregation laws was that the white race should be kept pure, and Asians are not white people, right? Asians and blacks are colored. So it broadened the scope, the sphere of the segregation laws. So eventually, Brewer would file a writ of certiorari. That's just saying, that you don't agree with the lower court's decision, and so you want judicial review from the U.S. Supreme Court. It got to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927, and at the time, William Howard Taft was Chief Justice. Uh, However, Brewer, who was an excellent civil rights attorney, had handled the case pretty well, but he was caught up in another case. He was defending a black, you know, a black family regarding a murder case. So that was priority for him. Now, someone was assigned to the case. His name was James Flowers, who had been a corporate attorney. He had no experience with 14th Amendment cases. And he'd never argued a case in a trial. And so he waived argument and asked that the court should decide on the briefs, right? And apparently his briefs were so bad, so poorly written, that even Chief Justice Brandeis, who was on the court at that time, was said to have told, was it Justice Frank Footer, that the attorney was incompetent, right? The attorney was incompetent. He was all over the place. So when you're arguing in court, when you're like in court, lawyers are supposed to, of course, be part of being logical is you're sticking, you make your argument consistent. You're sticking with your argument and you're not over the place. Because if you're raising one argument, right, and then you're making another point, even though they're supposed to they would buttress your point individually if you raise them as individual arguments, right, and expand on that individual point. But if you raise two different arguments at the same time, they might tend to conflict with each other, right? They may controvert, and it would just make you appear illogical, not just illogical, but it might reinforce the argument of your opponent, and which is exactly what James Flowers did in his briefs. He was arguing, on the one hand, that um, that there was a violation of the due process rights of Martha Lum, right, the Lums. On the other hand, he was not arguing that uh, segregation was inherently unconstitutional, right? That segregation was inherently unconstitutional. So, what what the what Chief Justice Taft and his court, what they decided to do was they did rule on that side, saying no, that segregation is not unconstitutional, right? And they decided in favor of the state of Mississippi, that saying that the state of Mississippi had the power to regulate its educational system. Of course, uh, William Howard Taft, even as president, he had leaned more on states' rights. And so he did this as Chief Justice. He focused on, he favored state rights, he prioritized state rights, and he tried to limit federal power. He tried to limit what he considered federal overreach, right? And so he said the states had the right to regulate their public school system. Of course, there were also the arguments that people had made previous arguments that the 14th Amendment only applies to the government and not private businesses. In this case, this was not a private matter, but the court basically was saying that the state has the authority to regulate its public school system, and that that segregating was not unconstitutional. And of course, it affirmed this decision of the Mississippi Supreme Court that Asians were not white people, and they had parallel systems. Besides, Howard Taft was also saying that there were alternatives. So that's something that judges always look for, that there are alternatives in jurisprudence. Are there alternatives to your claims? So the alternative was, well, they could attend colored schools, they're available to them, or they could attend private schools, right? But they can't attend white schools because the state law in Mississippi says that whites and coloreds should not attend school together, that they should be segregated, and that's within the purview of the state. So that's how uh, you know Chief Justice William Howard Taft basically uh, gave one of the most racist Supreme Court decisions. Uh, you know, institutionalizing and expanding the scope of segregation of public schools. And of course, this was subsequently overruled with the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which said that separate of but equal was unconstitutional, and it did violate the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law. Uh, Chief Justice um, Howard Taft is also notorious. There's another case I would like to actually look at, I guess, in a subsequent video because I want to cut this off pretty soon. That's Olmsted versus United States, and that has to do with Fourth Amendment, right? There was a case of a wiretapping, and Chief Justice Taft was basically saying that uh, uh, a warrantless wiretapping, that's a wiretapping suspects without a warrant, search warrant, was was not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. This was subsequently overruled with the Katz case, right? Katz case. So I'll discuss that in another uh, uh, case. But it's kind of interesting that it's normally said that the case Lom versus Wright was a gave impetus to the subsequent civil rights litigation to desegregate schools, when in fact, the Lom family, the Chinese family, they were not looking to desegregate schools. They did accept segregation. They were just saying they didn't want to, they wanted to be segregated from the black kids from the black schools, and should be allowed to attend the white schools. Later on in the 1930s, interestingly, Mississippi created Chinese, public schools for Chinese students. And eventually, that family, the Lom family, they anticipated that the Supreme Court would rule against them. So they moved out, I think moved to Arkansas and moved to another state where their daughter was allowed to attend a white public school. And subsequently, Chinese families in America created private schools where the Chinese students could attend, where their children could attend. Um, Now, this is not to cast aspersions on uh, the Chinese community. It's so unfortunate that um, given terrible conditions, there's often a domino effect, a multiplier effect, as those who would not have been culprits inadvertently end up harming others as well, right? So, segregation was just a terrible period in America. And now the reason I wanted to discuss this was just because, I'd, been seeing articles, reading about how I try not to pay attention to the news. Of course, you need to know what's going on, but I'm going through my own personal situation right now with discrimination through a racist racist and corrupt um, state machinery in Montgomery County in the state of Maryland, which has violated my constitutional rights, and a racist and corrupt judge in Montgomery County, Judge James Bonifant, and a racist and corrupt state attorney's office, um, State Attorney John McCarthy, who have violated the Brady Doctrine. And of course, they also created false evidence. They're using false evidence, fabrication of evidence, and I've been denied my Sixth Amendment rights to a speedy trial. There was police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, and judicial misconduct um, in the first place, and there's been an abusive process. So I'm an innocent man whose rights have been violated because of my race and national origin. I'm an American citizen. But something I also wanted to talk about was the recent bans by President Donald Trump, especially since on Christmas Day, there were strikes on, ostensible um, um, jihadist or terrorist hideouts, enclaves in Sokoto in northern Nigeria. From my understanding and my studies, and I have friends, I've got friends in Nigeria. I've got family in the federal government. My brother works for the federal government in Nigeria. Um, I, I've got friends who are generals in the Nigerian military, right? And from what I understood was that terrorism was in northwest Nigeria. The Boko Haram terrorists were in northwest Nigeria, not in not in Sokoto. And in fact, a town that had nothing to do with terrorism was hit. It's rather interesting. Offer, you know, it they were hit, which is rather bizarre, right? That's actually close to my hometown. I mean, I'm from Lagos, but long story. But it's kind of really bizarre. Um, so, and at the same time, just a few weeks before the strikes, there's this phenomenon of Nigerians wanting, to flee from Nigeria or at least get some kind of education in the U.S. And this, of course, America, it's a law, it's a pathway America created. People who come in from F with an F1 visa, if they do very well in American schools, go to graduate school, they can end up getting to work. They can end up, if they're filing for green cards, if they get their green cards, and they can eventually become citizens, right? This has been a pathway for many Nigerians, many Asians, right? Um, of course, President Trump is now banning these pathways. The H-1B visa, there was a $100,000 penalty earlier this year that it was imposed, which, all but it's going to kill the H-1B pathway. And then there was a ban on Nigerians and several other countries. So Nigerians joined the list. Nigeria joined the list of nations, banned for F1 visas and even green card, right? The diversity green card, which had led many Nigerians who come to American schools and do very well. In fact, there have been recent studies which say that the Nigerian American community in America, they compare in educational attainment with Asian Americans, who are actually the number one when it comes to educational attainment, right? They're the most educated group in America, the Asian Americans. So it's rather interesting, and these bans on immigrants. There's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment with the raids. I just want to leave with this sentiment, this note that our founding fathers, from the beginning of our republic, right, from the Declaration of Independence, one of the priorities, one of the main grievances they had was that the king was obstructing the naturalization of foreigners, right? Was and so and preventing, I like the way Thomas Jefferson uses the phrase, was preventing, migrations hither. Of course, that was just an archaic term back then to say immigration, right? So our founding fathers wanted immigration. They made policies for immigration. And of course, let me also I just want to remind us that our founding fathers were not as, in fact, they welcomed immigrants, and they were not as terrified of immigrants as they were of American citizens who were uneducated, right? Alexander Hamilton, who is the architect of the American system, right? Alexander Hamilton himself, right? The father of the author of the Federalist Papers, which conservatives, you know, take to so much, right? Which they imbibe in. He called uneducated people a great beast, and he didn't want them to vote, right? He didn't want them to vote. He called uneducated Americans, the masses, a great beast. He didn't want them to vote. Similarly, John Adams as well. John Adams didn't think people without property and uneducated people should vote because he thought they didn't have the powers to reason because they would be easily swayed by a demagogue, right? Who would manipulate them just for their own interest, that there'll be a propertied class and the demagogues, they'll manipulate. If they gave the popular vote to uneducated Americans, that a demagogue who's a member of the propertied class would be able to manipulate them through their words because that the uneducated Americans, uneducated class cannot reason properly. So at the beginning uh, of America, people who like to, uh, you know, harp on originalism, right? The beginning of America, the uneducated were not allowed to vote. They're not part of the electoral college, right? They wanted only an educated elite, a property educated elite, to be able to vote. That's how America started off, right? Following our independence. I'm not saying everything the founding fathers did was good or bad, but they understood the significance of education for uh, for the preservation of our republic and democracy. You need a well-informed class. Is education the only marker? Is it the only marker to demonstrate that's a college degree? Is it the only marker to demonstrate um, education? Uh, no, a college degree is not the only marker. In fact, our first president, um, George Washington, did not have a college degree like the rest of his cabinet, but he was a very intelligent man. Because he constantly read. He had certificates. He was qualified. He actually People always dismiss the fact that he was actually a certified surveyor, right? And it's difficult for us to tell how people read. Abraham Lincoln didn't have a college degree, but he was a qualified lawyer from self studying. So that was an era that allowed people uh, to just learn on their own. So he was an autodidact. The same thing with Millard Fillmore, right? They could learn on their own. Many of our founding fathers, even Andrew Johnson, who'd been a tailor, he studied laboriously on his own. He became a great orator. So now, yes, we have a society that gives American citizens, Americans, the opportunity uh, to learn on their own, to be autodidacts. But the studies show the markers, the parameters, right? They show that is not the case. Americans, because we have far many more distractions. People can work and do menial jobs to make money, and they constantly want to get the dollars, and there are other things, other distractions like television, right? So Americans are, in fact, it's studies are showing that Americans, what they said, only about half of Americans, adults cannot read. Of us, amongst the Gen Z and half of them cannot read. They read at the proficiency of a middle schooler, right? Many adults. So, uh, you know, math is even worse, right? Math is even their math skills are even worse, right? Nothing to write home about. So, because of the competing distractions, and of course, this is an instance of exaggerated liberty, where because we have liberty, we don't do what is good for the what is preferred for the common good, right? Exaggerated liberty. Our liberty is abused, and we're not doing what's what's proper for the commonwealth, for the common good. So I will stop here. The video's gotten rather long, and so I just wanted to remind us how there's that nexus between. There's always been that nexus between education and immigration in America, and from the beginning of our republic, education has always been very important, very critical, and who has access to education has always been crucial. There are more opportunities now. Uh, However, yeah, we need to be very cautious about the flagrant attacks on the ability of um, people of color to emigrate into America and to get educated, to be educated. At the same, education is very costly now. So people go to college through student loans. Now the government is it trying to end the Department of Education and impede the ability of marginalized communities, historically marginalized communities, from accessing loans? Of course, when the population, the citizenry is educated, well educated, it ultimately benefits the nation because well educated people make the best citizens. They're good citizens, right? Something schooling actually does, it teaches you to follow rules, to comply, right? It enhances your ability to comply, to follow rules, right? And the government wants a citizenry that's compliant. Apart from the fact that, yes, you enhance your intelligence because you learn more, the more you read, learn, and do math problems or learn science, the better it is, for your thinking, right? So you make better decisions, which benefits the whole society. You don't go out committing crimes. And then you get a good paying job, a high paying job, or you can be an entrepreneur. You can invent things and you're gonna earn a high income and pay taxes, right? Pay taxes. Even though most of our taxes are just going to pay government workers who have government work as a sinecure, right? In any event, let me end this here. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I just discussed President Howard Taft's, uh, you know, decision in the infamous Lum versus Rice, which basically expanded segregation to the Asian community, saying that, well, segregation against Asians uh, was constitutional as well. And say, so that's what it does. I also draw attention to color of law violations that I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland, based on false charges pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, and the abusive process by a corrupt um, um, judge in Maryland, Judge James A. Bonifant of Montgomery County Circuit Court, and a corrupt state attorney's office, John McCarthy, led by John McCarthy. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.